Hi, in this video, we are going to look at how to set up a single sign-on experience in Evolve Zoom. Single sign-on allows you to log in into your Zoom repository using your corporate credentials or your social identities such as a Gmail or a Facebook identity. In order to set up single sign-on, we will go through the following topics. First, we look at the basics of setting up an OpenID Connect application in Zoom. Next, we'll look at why we need LDAP connectivity in order to sync up the user information for using single sign-on. And finally, we'll look at the single sign-on experience in the desktop and web application. Single sign-on setup requires the administrator to first configure the OpenID Connect provider with Evolve. It's a fairly involved process and it varies based on the OpenID provider. So if you're using, for example, Ping Federate or Azure AD or G Suite, etc., the process will vary, even though OpenID Connect is a standard-based protocol. So in this video, we will cover the basics of OpenID Connect setup, but you must consult with your OpenID provider administrator for more insights on how to complete the registration. So in order to start with the basics of OpenID Connect, the easiest would be for you, the user, to go ahead and search in our help article database for the specific provider. So for example, if I were doing this with Microsoft Azure AD as my OpenID Connect provider, you can follow this guide here for step-by-step instruction. So there are two steps basically. First is to do a app registration, a client app registration with the Azure AD acting as the OIDC provider. Once you have done that, then the next step would be in the Evolve Zoom service to connect the OpenID provider as the IDP for all single sign-on authentication experience. And this requires exchanging a bunch of URLs to redirect the user to the correct provider. So you are going to have to go to the OIDC provider, in this case Microsoft Azure. So I'll just open it up to show you what it entails. And in Microsoft Azure instance that you have, you will have a Azure AD tenant, and in that you will go ahead and create an app registration like what I have here. In the app registration, you will need to know the URLs to Evolve where the redirect would be sent for login or logout, and that's typically the Evolve server. Port is the web administration port. It says here 10443. Your admin port would typically be 9443 and not 10443. So whichever it is the case, you will need to have your admin URLs, and the rest of the API for the URL is exactly the same. So it'll always be a Zoom server 9443, for example, /auth/OpenID login. So once you finish this registration, you would basically get a bunch of tokens that would be generated as part of setting this up. And you would need those tokens and the information from this manifest file to go to the next step, which is configuring the OpenID connectivity from Evolve. Now, there's one more step, which is the need for an LDAP connectivity. So OpenID Connect is used for the actual authentication workflows with login, logout URLs going to your OpenID provider. But Evolve also requires a list of internal users and even external users that are going to be licensed in Evolve Zoom as valid user accounts. And in order for us to get the list of users, we depend on LDAP protocol. So with your OpenID Connect setup, you must also configure an LDAP server that can sync the user information from your identity provider database and send that over to Evolve. So that requires you to, if you're working with Microsoft Azure AD, set up Azure AD domain services. Now this will vary again based on your IDP. If you're using Okta or you're using Ping Federate, then you might directly be talking with Microsoft AD, or you might be using with connecting with a LDAP connector that they provide. But the key thing here is that you must enable secure LDAP access to the same IDP where the user database resides. So once you have the Azure AD domain services configured, then you are ready to head over to the Evolphin side of this. So you will come to the Evolphin web admin and click on the server control panel, where you will find the SSO configuration and the LDAP settings. So the first thing to do is to set up the LDAP configuration. In the LDAP settings, you would point the LDAP server to the Azure AD domain services hostname and port. Like I have here 636, and you will specify rest of the LDAP attributes in order to connect Evolphin with domain services and for it to pull all the username. The key thing here would be to ensure that you use the correct username attribute. With a single sign-on with Azure AD, that typically is the user principal name, which also happens to be typically the email address of the user. So that's the unique user handle that will be used to authenticate the user. Now, if you're switching from our local user database or a pure LDAP realm to single sign-on, keep in mind this will change the user identity. So if the user was authenticating before as Patrick using our local user database, once you switch over with a user principal name, the user might authenticate with patrick@evolphin.com. Once you have tested the LDAP connectivity, then you can come to the single sign-on configuration. Now, all the information that you see here is going to be accessible to you from your identity provider. So if Azure was the identity provider, all the information you need, like the app ID and the other tokens and URLs, would be accessible from your IDP. So this is something an OpenID admin would be able to help with. So once you gather all the information, then you just need to fill in this form the various fields. There are a couple of fields that are key here. One of them is called client secret file name. So in order for the trust to be established, we support a file-based secret exchange between the identity provider in Evolphin, and all the OpenID providers can supply you with a client secret that you can save it in a file and make it accessible to the Zoom server. If your Zoom server is hosted by Evolphin or managed by Evolphin, then this piece of setup would be done by Evolphin. You will just need to send them the client ID, the client secret, and the information from the manifest. Okay, so once this is all done and the server configuration has taken effect, then now you're ready to start using the single sign-on module. So first thing you would do is make sure you pull using LDAP button here all the users that need to be authenticated by Evolphin and need to be managed in the repository. And when you click this, it'll go and talk to the Active Directory domain services and pull the information. Now, any external users that you might have in the system, these are users who are outside the core user directory perhaps, they can still be managed using the Azure AD portal or your IDP. So all the IDPs support federation with third party. So you can come in here and click on external identities, for example, in Azure AD, and you will see a list of federations. So for example, Google or Facebook social identity might be federated using SAML. Or if you want to add another federation using SAML or WSFed, you can just click here, provide the details, and you would have been able to now federate. Why would you want to do that? So this allows you to work with external agencies or companies outside your corporate domain with their own IDP, like a SAML IDP, and Evolfin, when we authenticate Evolfin with Azure AD as the service provider, it can automatically do a back channel authentication by federating it with the identity provider for that specific domain. Now, if your user is in Microsoft Azure AD domain, in a completely different domain, then there is nothing to set up. With the Azure AD configuration, federation with other Azure AD domain is typically automated. So that's the setup part, and the user experience is the user, when they get to our desktop client or the web client, they will see a message to connect with the single sign-on provider, and you can change the string. If you don't want to call it Azure, you can call it connect with Okta, connect with single sign-on. And the user experience is, when they click here, based on the configuration that you have set up, Evolfin will redirect you to the IDP. So you can see it is redirecting us to microsoftonline.com. Once I click the specific account, now what you are seeing is SAML federation, where we went from Microsoft to Google, had the user authenticate with their G Suite identity, and then they were able to log back in even to Evolfin. So that is how seamless the single sign-on is. If you did not have a SAML federation and you just wanted to have the external user or internal user authenticate against the OpenID provider, that would be something you configure on your OpenID provider, whether federation is allowed or not. Thank you for watching this video.